Hello and welcome to the Daily Dulcinea. Today is August 28th, 2008, and on this day in history in 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech. Chris, can you describe the events of that day for our audience?
Yeah, it was actually it was a very broad gathering of people and organizations organized by civil rights groups and labor unions from across the country, especially the South. Martin Luther King was actually just one of many speakers that addressed the crowd that day, and they had expected a few thousand people to show up, but it ended up being anywhere from 200 to 300,000 people
No kidding.
who actually showed up on Washington Mall for the day.
And can you tell us a little bit about his speech? Most people know the second half of the speech, but you were telling me before that there's actually two parts to the speech.
Well, the first half of his speech was really just kind of painting the picture of the state of African Americans and minorities as a whole in the United States at the time. It was kind of painting a very grim picture of how things were. And then there was about halfway through the speech, he kind of turns on a phrase, which is not to wallow in the valley of despair. And the second part is what everyone kind of remembers with the refrains of "I have a dream" and "Let freedom ring." But it's the first half that kind of, it really laid the groundwork for what work needed to be done. So.
And who supported this? Because when I think of this, I always think that, JFK was behind this march and that other leaders were behind this march, but that
surprisingly enough, they didn't actually have a very wide base of support from anyone, from the African American community, from the white community. Mainly, while John F. Kennedy did actually support the work Martin Luther King was doing, he and the head of the FBI and a lot of other people in the government had a feeling that it would actually turn into some kind of a maybe an out of control event or possibly violent event.
I see.
And then in the African American community, they didn't have a tremendous amount of support either. You had Stokely Carmichael and Malcolm X speaking out very, very strongly against the actual march. They called it the farce on Washington. And they said it didn't really represent the larger struggle. It was a very narrow part of what needed to be done.
But of course, it did go through that day.
It did. It seemed to have been validated by the fact that 250,000 people did show up.
Right.
You have that kind of crowd. It kind of it validates the effort.
Absolutely. And so then, what was the aftermath?
Well, the aftermath tended to be at the time the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act was actually in Congress being debated at the time, and part of the march was to put pressure on Congress to address it, to pass it. And they did say that both the march and the speech and all the attention paid to it really put enough, kind of the final straw to pass both the Civil Rights Act the following year, 1964, and the National Voting Rights Act in 1965. So they kind of credit the march and the speech and the attention that it garnered for the passage of those two landmark bills.
Wow. Well, thank you very much for your report.
Right.
And for more information on this story as well as others, please visit us at findingdulcinea.com. Thank you, and we hope to see you again tomorrow.